The winter of 1969 seemed colder than most, the kind of cold that seeped not just into bones but into thoughts. It was a January morning at St. Hildegard's School for Girls, a sprawling Victorian complex of red brick and shadowed archways, tucked deep into the English countryside. The place had a habit of swallowing sound, of making every footstep feel heavier than it was. The fog that morning was not the gentle kind. It came rolling up from the river valley like a tide, thick and white, curling around the old chapel spire and settling over the school grounds in folds. Even the crows that usually perched on the iron gates were nowhere to be seen, as if the air itself had persuaded them to leave. Inside the dormitories, the radiators clanked and hissed in protest against the cold. A caretaker named Thomas Whitlow moved quietly through the corridors, his lantern swaying with each step. He was a man of habit. Every morning he unlocked the side doors, checked the boiler, and made a round through the first-year dorms before the bell. It was in the third room on the east wing that his morning rhythm faltered. The bed nearest the window, bed 4, was perfectly made. The wool blanket was smooth, corners tucked with precision. The pillow sat untouched, the indentation of a head absent. On the desk beside it lay a neatly stacked pile of books, a half-finished drawing in black ink, and a fountain pen placed horizontally, as though it had been set down mid-thought. Whitlow frowned. He knew the girl in bed 4, quiet, small, with eyes that often seemed to be somewhere else entirely. He'd seen her reading in the courtyard during storms, her coat dusted with rain, completely unbothered by the weather. Her name, though it wouldn't be spoken aloud for hours yet, was Eleanor Vale. In the corridor, a clock chimed 6 times, its sound muffled by the fog pressing against the glass. Whitlow lingered, calling softly into the room, as if she might emerge from the shadows of the wardrobe. No answer. He told himself she'd gone down to breakfast early, though breakfast wouldn't be served for another 30 minutes. By the time the headmistress was summoned, the school had begun to stir. A few girls wandered toward the great hall, their chatter breaking into whispers when they saw Whitlow and the headmistress standing stiffly outside the dorm. A sense of something wrong spread faster than the winter wind. The headmistress, Mrs. Calder, was a tall, stern woman whose voice rarely betrayed her emotions. Yet, when she opened the desk drawer and found Eleanor's satchel, her timetable, and a pocket watch still inside, her composure slipped. "She hasn't left the grounds," Calder murmured, more to herself than anyone else. The police arrived just after 9, 2 constables in dark coats, their boots leaving wet prints on the stone floors. They asked the same questions again and again. When was she last seen? Who was on duty? Had she been ill? Until the answers began to feel rehearsed. Whitlow repeated what he'd seen: the bed untouched, the books neatly stacked, the drawing on the desk. That drawing would linger in his mind for the rest of his life. It was not of a face or a place, but of a circle intersected by dozens of fine lines, each marked with tiny symbols. It looked less like art and more like a map, but a map of what he couldn't say. Outside, the fog showed no sign of lifting. The search began with the grounds, the lake, the stables, the old orchard behind the chapel. Girls were kept in their dormitories, peering through frost-edged windows at the shapes moving in the mist. Every so often, a name would be called into the whiteness. Eleanor. The sound seemed to dissolve before it could carry. By midday, the atmosphere at St. Hildegard's had shifted from curiosity to something closer to fear. The teachers tried to maintain routine, ringing the lunch bell, taking attendance, but the empty space where Eleanor's name should have been was impossible to ignore. In the staff room, Mrs. Calder stood by the window, watching the silhouettes of the constables fade in and out of the fog. "I've been here 23 years, she said quietly, and no one has ever simply disappeared." That word, disappeared, was the first time anyone put voice to what was unfolding. It carried a weight that pressed down on the entire school, as though naming it made it more real. By the time the sun sank, or rather the sky dimmed from gray to near black, Eleanor Vale had been gone for more than 14 hours. Her name was in the station logbook, her description already telegraphed to nearby towns. And somewhere, in a locked drawer in the headmistress's office, her strange unfinished drawing sat under a paperweight, the ink glistening faintly under the lamplight. The fog clung to the school well into the night, swallowing the sound of footsteps, the ringing of the chapel bell, and the unanswered calls for a girl whose mind was too sharp, perhaps, to ever truly belong here. If you were to ask the girls of St. Hildegard's who Eleanor Vale was, you'd receive as many answers as there were voices. Some would remember her as the girl with the notebook, always scribbling numbers while others laughed in the courtyard. Others would recall her as the girl with the music in her hands, fingers tracing invisible piano keys while she walked between classes. A few, the ones who had shared late-night whispers under blankets, would tell you she could recite entire constellations by memory, not just their names, but their mythologies, the ancient stories pinned to their shapes in the sky. Eleanor had arrived at St. Hildegard's in the autumn term of 1967, a year younger than most of her classmates. The headmistress had read her entrance exam twice, then a third time, unable to decide if what she was seeing was brilliance or some elaborate trick. By the age of 12, Eleanor could solve equations that took postgraduate students hours to understand. Not because she'd memorized steps, but because numbers, to her, were not rules. They were landscapes. She walked through them the way others might walk through fields, finding shortcuts no one else could see. Yet brilliance can be a kind of isolation. Her intelligence didn't draw people in. It kept them at a distance. In the echoing dining hall, she often ate alone, her head bent over a book, the steam from her tea curling into the air like smoke from a candle just snuffed out. When she spoke, her voice was soft, careful, as if she'd measured each word before letting it go. One classmate, Margaret Flynn, would later recall, she never bragged about being clever. She just was. Like she had one foot in our world and one foot somewhere else. And she always seemed to be listening for something the rest of US couldn't hear. Her teachers didn't always know what to make of her. Mr. Penwright, the mathematics master, a thin man with ink stains perpetually on his fingers, once gave the class a problem involving the distribution of grain among 3 markets. Eleanor returned her solution within minutes, but alongside it, she'd written a second solution, one that accounted for weather patterns, transport delays, and shifts in market demand. When asked why, she'd simply said, "Because the first answer isn't the real answer." The staff began to keep small notes about her, nothing formal, just observations jotted in the margins of attendance sheets, writes equations in musical notation, frequently gazes out windows during lessons, shows advanced understanding of symmetry, speaks to no one during breaks, except the gardener. That gardener, a war veteran named Harold Finch, was perhaps the only adult she sought out willingly. She'd find him trimming the hedges or tending to the greenhouse, and sit nearby, drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Finch said she often asked questions about things far beyond her age, about the way light refracts through water, about the mathematics of a spider's web, about whether sound could travel through stone. She had a mind like a river, Finch would later tell an interviewer. Always moving, always finding new paths. But she also had, I don't know, a sadness. Like she'd already figured something out that the rest of us would rather not know. In the winter of 1968, Eleanor began filling her notebooks with diagrams that blurred the line between art and mathematics. Spirals nested within spirals, intersected by lines dotted with strange symbols, some resembling letters, others entirely unknown. She never explained what they meant, though she once told Margaret, "It's not about what the shapes are. It's about what they're hiding." The other girls might have called her strange, but there was something magnetic about her stillness. Even in the noisy chaos of the dormitory, Eleanor seemed untouched, her presence quiet but unshakable. At night, when the lamps were out and the corridors lay in darkness, she would lie awake, eyes fixed on the patterns of frost forming on the window, as if they were whispering secrets to her. And then there was her music. Though the school's piano had been out of tune for years, Eleanor could coax from it sounds so delicate they seemed to belong to another place entirely. She never played full songs, only fragments, a few bars here, a chord progression there, as if she were testing how certain notes might fit together in ways no composer had attempted before. Some staff claimed they recognized the structure in her playing. Mathematics translated into sound. Her brilliance, however, didn't shield her from the quiet cruelties of adolescence. She was left off invitation lists for weekend walks to the village. Whispers followed her in the corridors. The witch. The robot. The spy. If these things hurt her, she didn't show it. But in her final term, something in her seemed to sharpen. An alertness, a sense of urgency, as if she were racing a clock only she could hear. By the time the new year arrived, Eleanor was working on something that consumed her every waking hour. Teachers noticed she stayed later in the library, sometimes past curfew. The blue notebook, the same one later found empty on her desk, became her constant companion. She guarded it fiercely, sliding it into her satchel the moment anyone drew near. In the weeks before she vanished, she appeared thinner, her eyes shadowed, but her movements quick, almost electric. Margaret would later remember the last time she saw Eleanor smile, truly smile, was the night they stood under the old oak looking up at Orion. Eleanor had pointed to the stars and whispered, "Everything is connected. Not like a chain but like a circle. Once you find the right angle, it all falls into place." When she disappeared, that was the sentence Margaret couldn't forget. And it was only years later that she wondered if Eleanor had been speaking not about the stars at all, but about the thing that would one day be called the equation. St. Hildegard's had always been more than a school. That much you could feel the moment you walked through its wrought iron gates. Gates crowned with the Latin motto in silentio sapientia, in silence, wisdom. Founded in 1882, the school's origin was whispered about more than it was taught. Officially, it had been established to educate the daughters of Britain's brightest and most promising families. Unofficially, there were murmurs that it had been funded by a discreet coalition of industrial magnates and government patrons. Men who believed the empire's future might rest in the minds of exceptional young women, so long as those minds could be shaped to serve the right purposes. Its grounds stretched over 200 acres, though most of the land lay unused. Dense woodland to the north, an abandoned quarry to the east, and beyond the hedgerows, the slow-moving Greymere River. The main building itself was an unsettling blend of beauty and severity. High-arched windows that let in light but not warmth, staircases worn down by decades of footsteps, corridors that seemed to narrow as you walked them. A faint scent of chalk and coal dust hung in the air, as if the past refused to be swept away. Every student who passed through St. Hildegard's learned quickly that there were rules you could find in the handbook, and rules you couldn't. The first set was simple: attend chapel twice weekly, wear your uniform neatly, speak to the staff with respect. The second was harder to pin down, but far more important. You did not ask why certain rooms were always locked. You did not wander the West Wing after dark. And you did not, under any circumstances, question the headmistress's decisions. The archives were a perfect example of this duality. The school maintained a small but well-catalogued library for the girls. History books, literature, mathematics texts. But somewhere else, in a locked room off the administrative hall, there existed a second archive: ledgers, letters, and files that no student had ever seen. Only a handful of senior staff held keys, and those who did rarely spoke of its contents. One former teacher, long retired, would later claim in an interview, that archive, it wasn't just school records. There were dossiers in there on certain girls, not just their grades but their family histories, their political connections, even medical reports that went far beyond the usual. It was thorough. Too thorough. In the winter Eleanor disappeared, the school was undergoing subtle but telling changes. There were new faces among the staff: a visiting mathematics lecturer from Cambridge, who came once a week; 2 men from the ministry, who claimed to be there to evaluate the school's facilities. Their presence was always accompanied by quiet conversations in corners, papers hastily shuffled into drawers when footsteps approached. To the students, it was just another layer of the school's mystique. To those who paid attention, it was a sign of something being prepared. Eleanor, with her quiet intelligence, paid attention. Margaret Flynn remembered seeing her once, standing in the corridor outside the headmistress's office, watching as 2 strangers carried in a crate marked with a symbol she didn't recognize, a circle intersected by a series of angled lines. Eleanor's gaze followed the crate until it vanished through the door. When Margaret asked what it was, Eleanor only replied, "It's not for the library." It wasn't unusual for St. Hildegard's to host guest lecturers or display rare artifacts, but these new arrivals didn't teach classes or mingle with students. They kept to certain rooms, often late into the night, and left before dawn. The only sign of their work was the occasional faint hum of machinery, out of place in a school still heated by coal furnaces. Mr. Penwright, the mathematics master, was one of the few teachers who seemed uneasy about these changes. Though he never spoke openly, his mood had shifted. He would glance over his shoulder during lessons, his eyes flicking to the door whenever there was a knock. Once, during an advanced geometry class, he stopped mid-sentence, scribbled an equation on the blackboard, and told Eleanor, "Think about the spaces between numbers, not the numbers themselves." It was the last private exchange she had with him before she vanished. The school's secrecy was not limited to the present. Its past was equally obscured. In the alumni records, there were gaps where names should have been, entire graduating years reduced to a single line, records unavailable. Staff turnover was unusually high in certain decades, with teachers leaving midterm for reasons never explained. Somewhere in the school's century-long history, secrecy had stopped being a precaution and become its defining character. It wasn't just about keeping the outside world from knowing too much. It was about keeping the inside world in the dark too. And in the weeks leading up to January 1969, that darkness seemed to deepen. Doors that had always been unlocked were suddenly bolted. Students were told certain areas were under repair, though no workmen were ever seen. And, for reasons no one understood, the school's telephone line was restricted to outgoing calls made only by the headmistress herself. For Eleanor Vale, a girl whose mind worked like a key, forever searching for locks, this was not background noise. It was a pattern. And if her notebooks were any indication, she had started to trace it. The tragedy, of course, is that patterns lead to answers. And answers, in a place like St. Hildegard's, were dangerous things to have. It began, as many obsessions do, with a single page. Sometime in late December of 1968, Eleanor started filling her blue notebook with a series of mathematical sequences that didn't fit neatly into any known discipline. They weren't algebraic proofs, not exactly. Nor were they physics equations in the traditional sense. They were something else, a hybrid of pure mathematics, geometry, and something that felt more like music than numbers. The first few pages looked almost normal. Prime number grids, Fibonacci spirals, elegant arcs intersecting at calculated points. But as the days passed, her work grew stranger. She began layering musical notation over the numbers, marking bars and rests where none should logically exist. Some figures resembled waveforms. Others seemed like architectural blueprints, impossible buildings sketched in numbers instead of lines. Margaret Flynn remembered once catching a glimpse over Eleanor's shoulder in the library. The page she saw was covered in circles, each divided into 12 segments like a clock face. Along the outer rim were numbers. Inside, where the hands of a clock might meet, there were symbols Margaret didn't recognize. Some Greek letters, some like runes, some entirely invented. When she asked what it was, Eleanor simply closed the book and replied, "It's not for school. It's for later." A puzzle no one could classify after her disappearance, the notebook was among the first items collected as evidence by the police. At first, it was treated as a curiosity, the work of a gifted child playing with ideas she didn't fully understand. But one constable, who had studied mathematics before joining the force, noticed something odd. The sequences weren't random. They followed a rhythm, one so precise it was almost mechanical. The notebook was sent to a mathematics lecturer at Cambridge for review. His written assessment, later preserved in the police file, was short but unsettling. "The patterns in these pages are unlike anything I've encountered. They are not incomplete, they are deliberately unfinished. It is as though the writer has laid out every stone of a path except the final few, daring the reader to find where it leads." Days later, the notebook vanished from the evidence room without explanation. The last page Margaret, who had been one of the few people Eleanor seemed to trust, later told a journalist about a particular entry she had seen just before the disappearance. It was a single, sprawling equation that stretched from the top of the page to the bottom. Instead of ending with an answer, it ended with a short sentence written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. "If solved, the door will open." When Margaret asked her what it meant, Eleanor had smiled faintly, as if at a private joke. "Not a real door," she'd said. "At least not the kind you can walk through." Those words would take on a chilling weight in the years to come. Interpretations and theories to some, the door was metaphorical, a child's way of describing the act of unlocking a difficult problem. To others, it hinted at something more literal. A few amateur theorists later claimed that Eleanor's equation bore resemblance to early chaos theory, decades ahead of its time. Others saw in it the fingerprints of cryptography. patterns that could encode information in ways no standard cipher could match. One retired codebreaker, shown a copy of one of her earlier pages, remarked, "If this is what it looks like, you're telling me a 12-year-old stumbled onto a pattern we were still chasing in the mid-70s. And if she did, someone would have noticed. Someone would have wanted it." The music and the math, the most haunting element of the notebook wasn't the numbers at all. It was the music. The notation Eleanor had woven into her work wasn't decorative. Musicians who later examined the pages realized that if played, the sequences formed strange, looping compositions. They didn't resolve in traditional ways. Instead, they cycled, subtly shifting each time through, like a melody trying to remember itself. One pianist, after attempting to play a section, said the music gave her an inexplicable sense of déjà vu, as though, "I'd heard it in a dream years before." This blending of disciplines, math and music, geometry and rhythm, suggested that Eleanor wasn't just solving a problem. She was building something. Something that couldn't be expressed in numbers alone. The feeling in the room, those who handled the notebook spoke of an odd, almost physical sensation while looking at it. The headmistress, Mrs. Calder, reportedly kept it in her desk for 3 nights before the police took it, and later confided to a colleague that she'd woken each night at the exact same time, 3:12 a.m., certain she had heard faint piano notes coming from the direction of the locked library. Whether this was imagination, coincidence, or something more, no one could say. But it added another thread to the growing tangle of unease that surrounded Eleanor's disappearance. By the time the fog settled over St. Hildegard's on that January morning, the equation was more than a curiosity in a girl's notebook. It was, to those who had glimpsed its potential, a key. And keys, especially ones that open unknown doors, have a way of attracting hands that should never hold them. January 14, 1969. The night before Eleanor Vale vanished, the official records say nothing unusual happened. The school dinner was served at 6. Shepherd's pie, steamed cabbage, bread pudding. Attendance was taken, homework collected, lights out at 10. But official records are clean by design. The truth, as it emerges from the recollections of those who saw her that night, is not clean. It is fractured, contradictory, like shards of a mirror that refuse to fit back together. Witness 1. Margaret Flynn. Margaret swears she saw Eleanor just before curfew, sitting beneath the old oak in the courtyard. The air was sharp with frost, the kind that bites at your fingertips, yet Eleanor sat bareheaded, staring up at the winter sky. When Margaret called out, Eleanor looked over and said, "The stars are clearer tonight. Easier to read." She didn't explain what she meant. Instead, she tapped the notebook on her lap, then closed it, sliding it into her satchel as if sealing away the thought. Witness 2, Mrs. Atherton, the cook in the kitchen. Mrs. Atherton remembers something unusual. Eleanor didn't come for dessert. She loved bread pudding, Atherton said later. Never missed it. But that night she just walked straight past. Didn't even look at me. Her eyes, they were somewhere else. Atherton assumed it was the sulk of a child preoccupied with schoolwork. Only later would she recall the faint dusting of snow on Eleanor's shoulders, as though she'd already been outside before dinner. Witness 3. Harold Finch, the gardener Finch, the war veteran who tended the grounds, claimed he saw her near the library after curfew. He was making his last check of the greenhouse when he noticed a flicker of light in the upper windows. Not the steady glow of the reading lamps, but a quick pulse, as if someone were moving a torch. When he stepped closer, he swore he saw Eleanor's silhouette framed in the glass, her head bent over something on the desk. But when he entered the library minutes later, the room was empty, the lamp still warm. The timeline unravels 3 sightings. 3 different locations. Each told with conviction. If Margaret is right, Eleanor was under the oak at 9. If Atherton is right, she passed the kitchens just before then. And if Finch is right, she was in the library past 10. Even the most generous interpretation strains logic. The distances between those places don't allow the movements described, not without being seen by others. And yet all 3 witnesses swear they are certain. The final clue somewhere in the police file, now missing, there was a note made by the first constable to interview the witnesses. Possible change of clothing. Margaret reports dark coat. Finch describes pale nightdress. Atherton unsure. It's a small detail, but it gnaws at the edges of the story. If true, it would mean Eleanor not only moved between these locations, but also changed attire in the process. Something that suggests planning, not wandering. The last words recorded there is one more account never entered into the official timeline. A first-year student named Ann Hollister, only 11 at the time, later confided to her older sister that she'd woken in the night to the sound of footsteps outside her dorm. Peering through the cracked door, she saw Eleanor walking swiftly toward the east wing, the satchel clutched tight to her chest, and whispered her name. Eleanor paused, looked back and smiled. Not a warm, friendly smile, but the quiet, knowing kind, as though she was already on the other side of something, and asked where she was going. Eleanor's answer, if it was an answer at all, was, "It's time." The clock runs out by dawn. The fog had rolled in from the river, thick, white, and unbroken. If Eleanor moved through it in the early hours, she could have vanished within a dozen steps. No one would have seen her leave the building. No one would have heard the crunch of her shoes on the frost-hardened path. The fractured accounts, the oak tree, the kitchen, the library, the east wing, hang over the case like unanswered questions. Were they all mistaken? Or was Eleanor's last night on campus something more elastic than memory could hold? By the time the morning bell rang, the girl with the sharp eyes and the sharper mind was gone. And whatever she had been reading in the stars, whatever had kept her from dessert, whatever had drawn her to that lamplit desk, it was gone with her. By mid-morning on January 15th, the stillness of St. Hildegard's was broken by the growl of engines. 2 dark green Land Rovers pulled up to the main gates, their tires crunching over frost-crusted gravel. The local constabulary had arrived. Constables in heavy coats and flat caps stepped out, their breath clouding in the icy air. They spoke little as they unloaded their gear. Long-handled hooks, lanterns, coils of rope, the tools of a search that everyone hoped would be over quickly. Inside, the headmistress, Mrs. Calder, briefed the officers in her clipped, measured tone. Eleanor Vale, 12 years old, small for her age, brown hair tied neatly back, last seen sometime after dinner the night before. She had no history of running away, no known disputes with staff or students. The headmistress left out one detail, the notebook, not out of malice, but from something that looked more like calculation, as if she'd decided silently that not every part of Eleanor's life needed to be handed over. The sweep of the grounds, the search began with the obvious. The quadrangles, the dormitories, the school hall. Every wardrobe, every attic, every crawlspace. The boiler room was checked twice, the stables once. When those turned up nothing, the officers moved to the grounds. Bloodhounds were brought in from the nearest town. The dogs caught her scent almost immediately, but the trail led them in a strange loop, from the east wing to the library, across the courtyard, and then out toward the orchard. There, just beyond the last row of frost-covered trees, the scent simply stopped. The constable handling the lead hound later said, "It was like she'd stepped off the earth. No footprints in the snow. No disturbance of the brittle grass. Just nothing." The lake on the second day, attention turned to Graymere Lake, a dark oval of water half a mile from the main building. In winter, it froze in jagged sheets, though the currents beneath never fully stilled. Rowboats were launched. Long poles broke the ice where it thickened. Divers in black rubber suits descended into the murk, their ropes trembling in the constable's gloved hands. They found nothing. No shoe, no scarf, no trace of fabric caught in the reeds. The water, as one officer put it, gave her back nothing. The perimeter by day 3, the search had widened to the surrounding fields and woodland. Farmers were questioned. Gamekeepers were asked if they'd seen a child crossing the hedgerows. The railway station in the nearest town was checked for any sightings, but the fog that morning had delayed half the trains, and the stationmaster's memory was a fog of its own. Helicopters, a rare resource for a rural search in 1969, were dispatched from the county seat. They hovered low over the frostbitten landscape, their shadows sweeping over the land like slow-moving sundials. The pilots reported reduced visibility from the air. The fog looked like a white sea, swallowing entire valleys. The fraying of resolve by the end of the first week, the number of searchers began to dwindle. Officers were called back to other duties. Volunteers from the nearby village, hardy men in tweed coats and gumboots, returned to their farms. The police presence shrank from a dozen men to half that, and then to a handful. The press, sensing that no body would be found, packed up their cameras and left. Officially, the investigation remained open. Unofficially, it was beginning to cool. One constable, speaking off the record, admitted, "It was like chasing a shadow that didn't want to be caught. Every lead collapsed into nothing." The vanishing of evidence. It was during this tapering off that the first irregularities appeared. The blue notebook, which had been logged into the station's evidence room, was gone. No one had signed it out. The logbook entry was simply crossed through with a single stroke of pen. When questioned, the desk sergeant claimed no memory of its removal. "Could have been sent to another department," he muttered. No record of such a transfer was ever found. Other items, a satchel strap, a torn scrap of paper found near the orchard, also went missing from the file. By the time the official report was archived, its evidence section was conspicuously thin. The quieting of the school back at St. Hildegard's, life resumed with the brittle determination of people pretending nothing had happened. The morning bell rang. Lessons were held. The girls were told Eleanor had left unexpectedly and would not be returning. Most were too young or too afraid to ask more. But a few, Margaret among them, noticed the difference in the air. The headmistress seemed to walk faster in the corridors. Certain doors that had been closed were now locked. The men from the ministry were gone, but the atmosphere they left behind remained. A sense that something had been tidied away, hidden under the floorboards, and the dust brushed over as if it had never been. The official search for Eleanor Vale lasted just under 2 weeks. On the 15th day, the remaining constables loaded their gear into the Land Rovers and drove away, their taillights vanishing into the mist. The gates closed behind them. But for those who lived within those walls, the search had never truly ended. It simply moved out of sight, into whispered conversations, hidden records, and the cold space in the dormitory where bed 4 still sat untouched. By February 1969, the fog around St. Hildegard's had lifted, but the fog around Eleanor Vale's disappearance only thickened. Officially, she was a runaway. Unofficially, she was a ghost story, whispered in corridors by girls who lowered their voices when teachers passed. But outside the school walls, in places where uniforms were not worn and rules were not printed, her name began to surface in stranger conversations. The codebreaker's remark it began with a retired codebreaker named Arthur Lyle, who had served in the government code and cipher school during the war. He happened to be a visiting lecturer at Cambridge when the police, still in the early days of the search, asked a favor. Would he look over the contents of a bright young girl's notebook found in her dormitory? He agreed. What he saw made him set his tea down without drinking it. The equations were not ciphers in the traditional sense, but they carried the architecture of one. Patterns that repeated, but only after a calculated distortion. Number strings that could be read differently depending on the point of entry. To his trained eye, it looked like someone attempting to create a self-evolving code, a system that would adapt its own rules as it was being solved. In 1969, such a thing was almost science fiction. Lyle's report to the police was polite but pointed. If this child arrived at these sequences unaided, she represents an asset of considerable potential. In the wrong hands, such potential would be of interest to more than just academia. 2 weeks later, Lyle was contacted by a gentleman from London who asked, without preamble, whether he still had a copy of the notebook. Lyle didn't, and the man's expression, he would later recall, carried a flicker of relief. The black car around the same time, a second thread emerged from within St. Hildegard's itself. The school's archivist, Miss Edna Blake, was an unremarkable woman in every respect, except for her habit of noticing what others ignored. In a diary she kept decades later, discovered by her niece, she described seeing an unmarked black car parked at the edge of the school's service lane, 2 nights before Eleanor vanished. It was not a local car. The registration was London-issued. 2 men sat inside. They did not smoke. They did not speak. They simply waited. At one point, Eleanor herself appeared at the far end of the lane, crossing from the library toward the dormitory. The men's heads turned in unison, tracking her movements until she was out of sight. Miss Blake did not see them leave. Rumors in the staff room in the weeks following the disappearance, subtle changes in the staff's demeanor suggested more was known than was said. The headmistress held private meetings with certain teachers, always behind closed doors. When asked about the police investigation, she would reply only, "It's being handled." Handled by whom was a question no one dared ask aloud. One younger teacher, in a moment of loosened tongue after too much sherry at a staff gathering, muttered to another, "This is what happens when they take an interest in someone too young. You think the Americans have their boy geniuses? We have ours." The remark was quickly shushed, but not quickly enough. The ministry connection. There was also the matter of the ministry visitors who had appeared at the school that winter. Officially, they were there to inspect facilities and review curriculum. But the rooms they spent the most time in were not classrooms. They were storage rooms, archives, and the locked library annex, where the older, dust-covered mathematics volumes were kept. One rumor held that these men were connected to the Post Office Research Station, a government facility involved in telecommunications and early computing. Another suggested ties to the Defense Evaluation and Research Agency, the kind of acronymed body that didn't exist on paper until years after its work was done. Recruitment in the Cold War era, the late 1960s, were not merely a time of social revolution. They were a peak moment in the shadowy competition for intellectual assets. The United States had its whiz kids in military think tanks. The Soviet Union scoured universities for mathematicians and physicists who could be quietly redirected into state projects. Britain, though smaller in scope, played its own games. There were programs, discrete, deniable, that identified prodigies in science, mathematics, and cryptography long before they were of age. The idea was simple. Find them young, guide them into the right channels, and ensure their talents served national interests. Whether this was mentorship or exploitation depended on which side of the locked door you stood. For someone like Eleanor, whose work hinted at encryption techniques years ahead of their time, the interest of such programs would have been inevitable. The quiet disappearance of a file in March 1969, the county police file on Eleanor Vail, was transferred to a regional office for further review. Within weeks, it ceased to be available for public record requests. Decades later, when an investigative journalist tried to obtain it under the Freedom of Information Act, the response was blunt: no such file exists. This, more than any rumor, suggested the involvement of an entity with the power to erase paper trails, not merely from a police station, but from the historical record itself. From ghost story to intelligence puzzle, by the summer of 1969, Eleanor's story had faded from the newspapers. For most, she was another missing child in a country where such cases were often unsolved. But in the closed circles of intelligence work, her name lingered, not as a tragedy, as a question. Did she run? Was she taken? Or, the most unsettling possibility, did she agree to go, drawn into a world she'd already glimpsed through the patterns in her own equations? In the years to come, fragments of her work would resurface in unexpected places. A mathematical paper in a restricted archive, a cryptographic algorithm tested in a government lab. None bore her name. But those who had known her handwriting, her way of thinking, claimed they saw her fingerprints in the margins. And so the whispers continued. Eleanor Vail, the 12-year-old genius who didn't vanish into thin air, but into the machinery of the Cold War. It was the spring of 2003 when the Blue Notebook returned to the world. Not through police work, not through confession, but through the dusty chaos of an estate sale. The historian and the box of documents. Dr. Simon Wetherell, a historian of mathematics at King's College, had a habit of trawling second-hand bookshops and clearance auctions in search of forgotten academic papers. That April, he attended the liquidation of a defunct Cambridge research laboratory, whose archives had been sold off piecemeal to cover debts. Most of it was the expected detritus. Lecture notes, outdated journals, yellowed technical manuals. It was near the bottom of one unmarked cardboard box that he found it, a small cloth-bound notebook, its corners frayed, the cover stained a deep indigo. The first page was blank, but the second bore a name in precise handwriting. Eleanor Vail. The name meant nothing to him at first. What stopped him was the work itself. The pages were filled with the kind of dense, intricate mathematics that looked almost like calligraphy. Spirals, arcs, grids, layered with musical notation, sequences that slid into patterns before breaking apart again. It was both beautiful and unnerving. Recognition. Wetherell's expertise was historical, not cryptographic, but he'd seen enough to know the work was unusual. Certain sequences bore resemblance to unpublished number theory conjectures from the 1960s. Others hinted at algorithms he recognized from much later. Decades later. The deeper he read, the more the work seemed out of time, as though it had been written by someone who knew not just where mathematics had been, but where it was going. It was on the final page that he saw the sentence, carefully inked with no smudges. If solved, the door will open. He did not sleep well that night. The attempt to solve in the months that followed, Wetherell showed the notebook to colleagues. Most were intrigued. Some were dismissive. But one, Dr. Catherine Lee, a young researcher in computational theory, was captivated. She spent weeks inputting sequences into her computer, trying to detect a coherent algorithm. She made progress, but the structure kept shifting under analysis, as though it was designed to evade definition. "It's not a static problem," she told Wetherell over coffee one evening. "It's alive. It reacts to the method you use." By 2004, they had a working theory. The equation was less an answer to a question than a set of instructions. For what, they couldn't tell. But the recurring symbols suggested a link to spatial coordinates, albeit in a form that could only be fully resolved with computational power unavailable in Eleanor's lifetime. The long silence, the notebook was shelved for years. Funding dried up. Wetherell moved into administration. Lee left academia for private sector work. But the notebook never left his possession. Sometimes, late at night, he would take it down from the shelf and run his fingers over the indigo cover, wondering what had happened to the child who wrote it. It became, in his mind, less an artifact of mathematics and more a relic of human mystery. 2019. The breakthrough came almost by accident. Dr. Lee, now working in quantum computing research, asked to borrow the notebook again. Her team had been experimenting with pattern recognition algorithms capable of processing massive multivariable datasets, the kind of system that could theoretically analyze patterns that shifted dynamically under observation. They fed Eleanor's sequences into the system. Hours later, the output was ready. It wasn't a number. It wasn't even an equation. It was a set of latitude and longitude coordinates. The coordinates, the location they pointed to was remote, a stretch of wind-beaten coastline in the far north of Scotland, miles from the nearest town. No significant settlements. No recorded landmarks. Just cliffs, sea, and the constant roar of wind. Lee called Wetherell that night. "It's either a coincidence," she said, "or she hid something there." Her voice, he would later recall, was tight, the kind of tension that comes from standing at the edge of something you're not sure you want to look down into. The decision to go they debated for weeks. Should they tell anyone? The police? The press? In the end, they decided on neither. The case was over half a century old, and they feared that handing it over would bury it in bureaucracy or, worse, attract the wrong kind of attention. Instead, they planned to go themselves. Two academics, a cameraman Lee knew from a documentary project, and a driver familiar with the Highland roads. The journey would take them north in the dead of winter, through terrain that had changed little since 1969. Wetherell would later say that the moment he saw the indigo notebook in that dusty Cambridge box, he had the feeling it was waiting for someone. But what he didn't realize, not until the coordinates appeared on that screen in 2019, was that it might have been waiting for him. The journey began in late January 2020, a time when the Highlands were still locked in winter's grip. Dr. Simon Wetherell, Dr. Catherine Lee, cameraman Jack Holroyd, and a hired driver named Callum Fraser loaded their gear into a battered Land Rover, the kind that seemed built for a road that might disappear without warning. They carried waterproof packs, climbing ropes, cold weather gear, and, wrapped in its own oilskin case, the indigo notebook. The drive north took 2 days. Motorways gave way to winding A roads, then to single-track lanes lined with skeletal trees. The further they went, the sparser the signs of human life became. Villages shrank to a handful of stone cottages. Petrol stations grew rare. By the time they reached the northern coast, the horizon was a line of steel-gray ocean and jagged cliffs. The land's reluctance, the coordinates led them to a stretch of coastline known locally as Duin Breist, the Broken Fort. It was a place of weathered rock and constant wind, where the sea had gnawed caves into the cliff face over centuries. The locals spoke of it with a kind of reluctant familiarity. It was dangerous land, prone to sudden fog and treacherous tides. When Callum asked an elderly fisherman in the nearest village about the spot, The man's eyes narrowed. Nothing there for you. Nothing but rock and ruin. But when shown the coordinates, the man said nothing more, only turned away, muttering something under his breath in Gaelic. First glimpse reaching the site meant leaving the Land Rover and hiking the last 2 miles on foot. The terrain was a patchwork of frostbitten grass and slick stone, the air alive with the roar of waves far below. The wind carried the smell of salt and something else, a faint metallic tang. When they finally stood at the exact coordinates, they found nothing remarkable at first glance. Just a section of cliff jutting out toward the sea, its surface cracked by time and weather. But Wetherell, consulting the notebook, noticed something. The drawings Eleanor had made, the intersecting circles and angled lines, matched the shape of the cliff's fissures with uncanny precision. The hidden entrance, it was Jack, the cameraman, who spotted it, a narrow seam in the rock, partly concealed by gorse and wind-blown debris. When they cleared it away, they found a rusted metal hatch set flush into the ground. No hinges visible, no handle. Just a circular plate with a shallow indentation at its center. Lee knelt and ran her fingers over it. "It's not corroded like the rest," she said. "Almost like it's been treated." It took all 4 of them, plus a crowbar, to pry it open. The sound it made, a low, groaning protest, was swallowed by the wind. Below was a metal ladder, vanishing into darkness. The descent one by one, they climbed down, their headlamps cutting narrow tunnels of light. The air grew colder, damper, tinged with the scent of oil and rust. The ladder ended in a narrow corridor lined with riveted steel, leading to a heavy door stenciled with faded letters. "Property of H.M. Government," Callum muttered. "This isn't a cave. This is a bunker." The door wasn't locked. It swung open with surprising ease, revealing a chamber that seemed frozen in time. Inside the bunker, the room was low-ceilinged, lit only by their torches. Against one wall, chalkboards stood in a row, their surfaces covered in dense mathematical notations, some of them exact copies of pages from Eleanor's notebook. Others were different, more complex, as though her work had been continued by other hands. On a steel table lay stacks of punched cards, the kind used in early computing. Beside them, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels empty, but its casing clean as though it had been maintained. There were no signs of recent habitation. No food, no bedding. But the air felt expectant, as though it had been waiting for someone to return. The spiral in the center of the room was something none of them could explain. A floor mosaic made of inlaid metal, depicting a perfect spiral. At its center was a small square recess, empty. The spiral matched a recurring motif in Eleanor's work, the same one that appeared in the margin of her final page. Lee crouched beside it. Whatever this is, it's not decoration. It's a device housing. Something was meant to sit here. The realization Wetherell, staring at the boards, began to piece it together. This was not a place Eleanor stumbled upon. It was a place she had been brought to. The bunker, the work on the boards, the continuation of her equations, all of it suggested she had been here after her disappearance. And if the last equations were hers, she had been working on something until the very end. The question wasn't just what she had been building. It was why she had chosen to leave it unfinished. They stayed less than 2 hours. The wind outside had grown harsher, and Callum warned of the incoming tide. As they climbed back into daylight, the sea's roar seemed louder, the cliffs sharper against the gray sky. When they reached the Land Rover, Jack turned to Wetherell. "So, do we tell anyone about this?" Wetherell didn't answer. He was still holding the indigo notebook, its weight suddenly heavier in his hands. They met a week after returning from Scotland, gathered in Wetherell's book-lined study. Outside London, rain slicked the streets, but inside, the air was thick with the low hum of unanswered questions. On the table between them lay the indigo notebook, a stack of photographs from the bunker, and printouts of the chalkboard equations they had transcribed before leaving. Catherine Lee sat with her hands folded, staring at one of the photos, the spiral mosaic at the bunker center. "It's not just a pattern," she said finally. "It's a timing mechanism. The layout matches a class of harmonic oscillators, only scaled far beyond anything for mechanical use." The pattern beneath the pattern. Wetherell leaned forward. "Explain." Lee reached for the notebook and flipped to a page midway through Eleanor's work. It wasn't a single equation. It was two-layered. One in numbers, one in intervals. The numerical layer is pure mathematics. The interval layer, the musical one, is timing. She was calculating when something should happen, not just how it could. Wetherell frowned. What happens? Lee looked at him for a long moment. That's the part one can't prove. But if I had to guess, she was predicting an event. Not astronomy. Not weather. Jack, the cameraman, who had been mostly silent since Scotland, now spoke. Like an eclipse? A comet? Lee shook her head. Too regular for celestial events. Too irregular for climate patterns. Whatever it is, it's rare but predictable. And it interacts with electromagnetic fields in a way that could disrupt or enhance signal transmissions. Wetherell felt the pieces click in his mind. Communications. In the late 60s, Lee continued, that would have been invaluable. For military intelligence. For anyone. If you knew exactly when the atmosphere would allow for near-perfect long-range transmission, Lee finished, you could send a message anywhere in the world without interception. Or, conversely, you could shut down signals entirely. The bunkers purposed the spiral mosaic, the chalkboard equations, the punched cards. They weren't fragments of a mystery anymore. They were components of a system. The bunker wasn't a hiding place. It was a lab built to model, and perhaps trigger, this phenomenon. Eleanor's role, whether voluntary or not, had been to refine the prediction until it was accurate enough to act upon. The most disturbing part, the final lines on the last chalkboard weren't complete. The numbers trailed off mid-sequence, as though someone had stopped mid-thought, or been stopped. Why bring a child? Jack broke the silence. Why her? Why a 12-year-old? Lee answered without hesitation. Because she could see it differently. Adults trained in the field would work from known equations, known rules. Eleanor wasn't constrained. She could connect music, geometry, and physics without caring if the methods fit convention. She wasn't building on the field. She was bypassing it. It made sense in a way that was deeply unsettling. To whoever had been running the project, Eleanor wasn't a child. She was a tool, the sharpest one they could find. Voluntary or taken, they circled the question that had hung over the case for 50 years. Did she choose to go to that bunker, or was she taken? Wetherell found himself speaking slowly, as though saying it aloud made it more dangerous. The witness accounts from her last night all described her as calm, even smiling. If she was terrified, she didn't show it. That suggested one of two things. Either she trusted whoever was leading her away, or she believed she was going toward something she wanted. Neither possibility was comforting. The missing piece, Lee pointed to the empty square at the center of the spiral mosaic. Whatever went there, that's the key. It could have been a device, a receiver, something to capture or amplify the phenomenon. Without it, the system can't run. Which means either it was never completed, or it was removed before we got there. Wetherell glanced at the notebook. And if it was removed, where is it now? No one answered. A hypothesis without proof. By the end of the night, they had shaped their theory into something coherent, though still fragile. Eleanor's equation predicted rare atmospheric conditions that could alter global communications. The bunker had been designed to model or exploit those conditions. She had been brought there to complete the work. For reasons unknown, a shutdown, an evacuation, or her own choice, the project was abandoned before completion. It was neat enough to satisfy a historian. And yet it left too many shadows. The unsettling thought as Lee gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door. There's something that bothers me, she said. The equation isn't finished. But if you follow the pattern far enough, it points to another date. Wetherell looked up sharply. When? Lee hesitated. 2 years from now. The door closed behind her, leaving the study in silence. Wetherell stared at the indigo notebook, feeling the weight of its pages. Somewhere, far from the rain-slick streets of London, a spiral of inlaid metal lay in the dark, waiting. And for the first time, he wondered if Eleanor's work had ever truly stopped, or if it had simply been counting down. It was the spring of 2024 when the letter surfaced. Not in an archive, not in an attic, but in the effects of a recently deceased solicitor in Bath. His name was Charles Edgerton, a meticulous man whose files were as neat in death as they had been in life. Among the folders, receipts, and legal briefs was a small, sealed envelope. The paper was thick, the seal unbroken. On the front, in a careful slanted hand, was written, "For Margaret Flynn." The handwriting Margaret, now 70 years old, lived alone in a quiet Sussex village. Her hands shook slightly as she held the envelope, not from age, but from recognition. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it in the margins of library books, on notes slipped under her dormitory door, and most of all in the looping symbols of a blue notebook that had disappeared more than half a century earlier. When she slit the envelope open, the smell of old paper rose like a ghost. The letter, it was short, less than a page, and dated March 1977. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the words were clear. "Dear Margaret, by the time you read this, much will have changed. I cannot tell you where I am, not because I don't want to, but because you would not be able to reach me. Please believe that I am safe and that I am still myself. The work we began, the numbers, the shapes, it was more important than we understood at the time. I have solved it, but solving it means I cannot come back. The door is open now, and I must walk through it. If you ever hear music where there is none, know that I am near." Margaret read it twice, then a third time, tracing the letters with her fingertip as if touching them might bridge the impossible gap between then and now. The mystery of its delay. Why had the letter taken nearly 50 years to reach her? Edgerton's records revealed nothing, except that the envelope had been placed in his custody in July 1977, along with a handwritten note reading, "Deliver only upon my death, or upon the death of the sender." No sender was named. It was impossible to know whether Eleanor herself had entrusted him with it, or whether it had been passed through intermediaries. The solicitor had never spoken of it, not to colleagues, not to family. Margaret's reaction for Margaret, the letter was both a balm and a wound. It proved Eleanor had lived for at least 8 years after her disappearance. It proved she had been thinking of her old friend. But it also confirmed the unbridgeable, that Eleanor had chosen a path that left no way back. When journalists later asked her about the line, "If you ever hear music where there is none," Margaret smiled faintly. "We used to sneak into the music room after lights out. She'd play these fragments, bits of melodies that never seemed to end. Sometimes I still hear them, when the wind comes through the trees just right." Wetherell and Lee learned the news. Margaret allowed a copy of the letter to be made for Dr. Simon Wetherell and Dr. Catherine Lee. They read it in silence, each struck by the same detail, the phrasing, "the work we began." This wasn't just Eleanor's project, it was something she believed they had started together, even if Margaret had never understood it at the time. For Lee, the phrase "the door is open now" was chilling. If the equations and coordinates led to the bunker, then what did walking through mean? Was it metaphor? Or was there another stage, another location, beyond what they had found? A voice that never aged. Jack, the cameraman who had been documenting Wetherell and Lee's investigation, described the letter as, "the first time Eleanor became real to me. Up until then, she was photographs and witness statements. But reading her words, it was like hearing her speak. And it didn't sound like a child. It sounded like someone who had crossed a threshold and couldn't return." The letter's final journey. Margaret kept the original letter in a locked drawer, but she carried a copy in her purse. She said it was because she didn't want to be without it, but in truth, she also feared it might vanish the way the notebook had. Once, in an unguarded moment, she admitted to Wetherell, "It feels like it found me for a reason, like I'm supposed to do something with it, but I don't know what." Echoes. A month after receiving the letter, Margaret was sitting in her garden when she heard it, a faint sequence of notes, high and clear, drifting on the wind. There was no one nearby. No open windows. No music playing anywhere. She closed her eyes and for a moment was 12 again, standing under the old oak, listening to Eleanor play. When she opened them, the sound was gone. The grounds of St. Hildegard's have changed in the half-century since Eleanor Vale's disappearance. The ivy is thicker now, climbing higher up the old brick walls. The West Wing, once off-limits, has been renovated into administrative offices. The library has new glass windows, and the dormitories have been refitted with modern beds, bright lamps, and fire alarms that hum faintly in the night. But on certain winter mornings, when the mist rolls in from the river and clings to the fields, The school looks almost exactly as it did in January 1969. And on those mornings, it is impossible not to feel her absence. The old oak still stands in the courtyard. Its bark is split with age, its branches stark against the winter sky. Beneath it, the ground is uneven, frost clinging to the grass in thin silver threads. This is where Margaret Flynn, now moving slowly but still steady, stands each time she visits. She looks up into the same branches they once stood under together, watching the constellations Eleanor claimed she could read like a book. Margaret says nothing during these visits. She simply waits, listening as though half expecting a quiet voice to speak beside her. The unchanged room inside the dormitory where Bed 4 once stood has been turned into a staff workspace. But if you look closely, if you ignore the filing cabinets and notice the faint outline in the floorboards, you can still see where the bedposts once marked the wood. One of the current staff, a secretary named Amelia Clark, says she doesn't believe in ghosts but admits that sometimes, when she's alone in a room late in the day, she'll hear the faint scratch of a pen on paper coming from the corner by the window. It's probably the pipes, she says, with a half-smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. The headmistress's ledger in the locked cabinets of the archive room, which is still kept behind a key despite being digitized years ago, there is a ledger that no one has quite managed to explain. The year 1969 is there in careful ink, but beside Eleanor's name there is no withdrawn or transferred or deceased. Only a single dash. A space held open, as if her status were waiting to be filled. Wetherell's reflection, Dr. Simon Wetherell returned to St. Hildegard's one last time before beginning work on his book about the case. He stood by the chapel steps in the early morning, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The fog that day was heavy, drifting between the buildings like a living thing. He told me later in an interview, it felt unfinished, like the place itself knew the story didn't end here, that it just moved on without her. The spiral appears again months after visiting the school. Wetherell received an envelope in the post, no return address. Inside was a photograph, a spiral identical to the one in the bunker floor, inlaid in metal on what looked like a concrete surface. There was no caption. On the back, in small, neat handwriting, "Not yet." The paper smelled faintly of sea air. Margaret's last words on the matter when asked if she believes Eleanor is still alive, Margaret always gives the same answer. Alive. Not in the way we mean it. But somewhere, yes. She believes Eleanor crossed into a life that cannot be tracked in ledgers or census records. A life beyond ordinary geography. She opened her door, Margaret says. And once you walk through a door like that, you don't come back the same. If you come back at all. The music in the fog on the final morning of filming, the crew returned to the school before dawn. The fog was so dense it seemed to press against the camera lens. The oak loomed above us, skeletal and black. It was then, faint at first, then unmistakable. We heard it. A sequence of notes, soft and deliberate, carrying just far enough to reach us through the mist. It was not the wind. It was not the creak of the oak's branches. It was music, the kind you hum when you already know where it leads. We froze, straining to pinpoint the source, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the fog. Closing words, the camera panned slowly across the courtyard, past the dormitory windows, the library, the chapel spire, dissolving into the mist. The narrator's voice, steady, almost reverent, closed the story. 55 years ago, Eleanor Vale stepped out of sight and into a story the rest of us are still chasing. Whether she was taken or whether she chose to go remains unknown. What we do know is this. She left behind a door half open and an equation no one can quite solve. And perhaps that's the way she wanted it. Some disappearances are not meant to be closed, only followed into the fog. The shot lingered on the oak for a few seconds longer, then faded to black. This ending leaves the viewer in that exact emotional space Eleanor's story demands. Somewhere between hope, loss, and the nagging suspicion that the mystery hasn't ended, it's simply waiting.